Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a subject that is frankly pretty unsettling, even if we are going to whisper our way through the dark parts. We're exploring the most intimate details of the Black Death, specifically what it actually looked and felt like to die from the plague. Forget the dramatic movie scenes for a second. Imagine you're just a merchant in 14th century London, going about your day, perhaps complaining about the price of ale, when you feel a sudden debilitating chill. You clutch your tunic, thinking it's just a sudden bone-deep fatigue, but the truth is, your body has already started the clock. You trudge home, maybe a little dizzy, and by the time you're settling into your straw mattress, the aches have turned into a hammering headache. Your skin is fire. Your teeth are chattering even as sweat plasters your hair to your temples. You're shivering, burning, nauseated, and then you notice it, the first tiny crimson pimple, not a zit you can ignore, but a hard, angry spot, likely in your armpit or your groin. You press on it, a sickening throb answering the touch, a realization blooming in your fever-addled mind that this is not a common fever. This is the first pimple of death. You've been selected, and in the medieval world, that selection meant only one thing. The grim reality of the Yersinia pestis bacteria is that its incubation period, the time between exposure and the first symptoms, was often just 2 to 7 days. That's barely a week to get your affairs in order, or more likely, barely a week to understand you were doomed before the symptoms fully manifested. This sudden onset is a mainstream historical fact that shocked society. One day you're haggling over wool, the next you're locked in a room desperately hoping that pimple is just a spider bite. Here's your cheeky reality check for the evening. Statistically speaking, if you were an average European living between 1347 and 1351, you probably wouldn't have survived this little ordeal. Historians estimate the Black Death killed between 30% and 60% of Europe's population in that first devastating wave. Think about that as you drift off. Those numbers are staggering. We often forget how much of a death sentence a simple bacterial infection was without modern medicine. We live in an antibiotic world. They lived in a world where the best a doctor could offer was, get to the truly strange cures later. The feeling of the initial sickness was so fast and so violent that it almost defied belief. It wasn't a slow wasting away. It was an ambush. You'd move from feeling vaguely unwell to being utterly prostrate and delirious in less than a day. The skin might begin to show what chroniclers called lenticular small dark spots scattered across the body, which gives us the much later coined and dramatic name, the Black Death. This darkening wasn't just bruising. In the worst cases, it was the start of acral necrosis, where tissue in your fingers, toes, or nose would literally die and turn black, a truly horrific sign that the infection had gone septic and was destroying your body's delicate machinery from the inside out. One slightly quirky tidbit that might make you shift a little in your bed: some chroniclers noted that the victims often developed an intolerably foul stench that permeated everything. This wasn't just the smell of an unwashed medieval person. It was the intense chemical-like odor of massive internal infection fever and the necrosis of living tissue. This distinct putrid smell led people to believe the plague spread through miasma, or bad air, which, while scientifically wrong, was a perfectly understandable conclusion to draw when the sick person suddenly smelled like they were already decaying. Now, as the headache gets worse and the fever spikes, your mind begins to drift and you're struggling to hold on to a clear thought. The delirium sets in the world, blurring into strange shapes and whispers. The historian still argues whether the primary vector for transmission was only the rat flea, or if the sheer speed and spread of the disease suggest a more significant role for human fleas lice, or even the pneumonic person-to-person airborne form from the very beginning. It's a debate that highlights just how terrifyingly effective the plague was at finding ways to breach medieval defenses, regardless of the particular insect or cough that spread it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're up for it, post your location and local time in the comments. It's always comforting to know we're all easing into the night together across time zones and continents. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The fever is rising, and that angry little spot on your groin, it's about to turn into the infamous Bubonic Bubo. You feel its swelling growing, becoming the unmistakable, terrible signature of the plague. You try to shift your position to relieve the intense pressure, but it's useless. The night is going to be a long one. You're tossing now the fever, holding you hostage, but your attention is entirely focused on that growing horror. That small, hard spot you first noticed, a lymph node doing battle with a hostile army of bacterias inflating into something monstrous. This is the moment you confront the Bubonic Bubo itself, the unmistakable hallmark of the Black Death. Imagine the swelling. It starts firm like a small painful egg embedded just beneath your skin. But over the next few hours, it doesn't just get bigger. It becomes excruciatingly tender, hot to the touch, and can swell to the size of an apple, sometimes even a melon. We're talking about a painful, grotesque lump that medieval doctors called a bubo, deriving from the Greek word for groin swelling, because that was one of the most common locations. Why the groin or the armpit? Think about where a flea, the primary vector, might bite you. It's often on the extremities or lower limbs, and the bacteria, Yersinia pestis, travels directly to the nearest cluster of lymph nodes, your body's filtration system. For a bite on the leg or foot, that means the inguinal nodes in the groin. For a bite on the hand or torso, it means the axillary nodes in the armpit, or sometimes the cervical nodes in the neck. Your body is trying valiantly to contain the infection, and these nodes are its tragic, swollen battlegrounds. The bubo itself wasn't black, contrary to some myths. It was often a sickly, purplish red, inflamed and ready to burst. The skin over it was stretched taut, shiny, and thin. The sheer pressure caused untold agony. This is where the disease gets its name, a mainstream historical fact that's often lost in the dramatic flair of the Black Death moniker, which more accurately referred to the dark necrosis, the black spots of the septicemic form, or perhaps the psychological blackness of the age. But the bubonic form, that was all about the agonizing swelling. For some, the bubo would never actually blacken, but instead it would become soft and liquefy, with pus essentially creating a massive, putrid abscess. A quirky or fringe tidbit from the period is that some folk remedies before doctors got involved, with their often lethal methods, involved applying poultices made of onion, fig yeast, or even dried toad paste to the bubo, hoping to draw out the venom. The idea was to encourage the bubo to burst and release the noxious fluids, which the patient and their family believed was the poison leaving the body. If the bubo did burst naturally, it could offer a slight, temporary reprieve from the pressure and pain. And in a tiny percentage of cases, the very, very lucky ones, this was the turning point towards a slow, agonizing recovery. But for most, by the time the infection had raged enough to form such a huge swelling, the bacteria had already broken free of the lymphatic system and entered the bloodstream. When the bacteria overwhelm the lymph nodes and enter the blood, the disease pivots into the much deadlier septicemic plague. This is where things accelerate toward the truly terrifying. You remember that initial rash of dark spots. They intensify now. The infection is causing disseminated intravascular coagulation, DIC essentially forcing your blood to clot excessively in the smaller vessels, cutting off circulation to your extremities. This is why you feel a terrible coldness in your fingers and toes, even though your core temperature is roasting. Your blood pressure tanks, your heart races to compensate, and you enter a state of shock. The skin mottles with large dark patches, the livor mortis that appears while you are still alive, causing you to turn physically black in patches. This is a crucial distinction. The swollen bubo defines the bubonic stage. The systemic hemorrhaging and necrosis define the septicemic stage. The delirium now is constant. You might be vomiting blood hematemesis or coughing it up, especially if the infection has spread to your lungs, the even more contagious pneumonic plague. Imagine trying to breathe the hacking cough tearing at your chest, knowing that every gasp of air you expel is potentially a death sentence for the relative or priest standing nearby. Historians still argue whether the extreme density and unsanitary conditions of medieval cities made the plague spread faster than a typical flea-borne illness should allow. The speed suggests that while the flea was the primary starter, person-to-person spread via the pneumonic form, where you essentially cough the bacteria onto others, was the engine that drove the catastrophic mortality rates inside dense urban centers. You're now a walking or lying biohazard, a burning epicenter of contagious misery. The final hours are a mixture of extreme weakness, organ failure, from the body being poisoned, and increasing confusion. There's a sudden exhaustion, a feeling of giving up the fight. Most chroniclers noted that death came quickly, often within 3 to 5 days of the first fever, leaving families stunned by the suddenness of the loss. One moment you're their loved one, the next you are a rapidly cooling corpse with grotesque swellings, a terrifying object that must be moved and buried immediately. Your short, fiery battle with the bubo ends here, leaving you simply another grim statistic in the horrifying march of the pandemic. The disease, however, is far from done. Having claimed you, it's already moving on to the next village, carried forward on the wings of fear and trade. Now that you've experienced the agonizing internal symptoms, let's widen our gaze and watch the disease move across the map. You step out of your infected dwelling, if you could still walk, that is, and see the entire continent under siege. This is the path of darkness, tracing the plague's initial arrival in Europe and its terrifying speed of transmission, a speed that modern epidemiology still struggles to fully reconcile. The conventional starting gun for the Black Death in Europe is the autumn of 1347, the port of Messina in Sicily. Mainstream historical fact tells us that a fleet of Genoese trading ships sailing from the Black Sea, specifically from the Crimean port of Kaffa, docked there. The scene was straight out of a horror movie. The sailors aboard were either dead or desperately ill, covered in those telltale buboes. The ships were known as death ships. But the plague didn't just appear out of nowhere. It had been working its way westward along the great trade routes, specifically the Silk Road, for years. Its source reservoir, the place where the Yersinia pestis bacterium lives naturally in wild rodent populations, is generally pinpointed to Central Asia, particularly the Tian Shan mountain region in what is now Kyrgyzstan. It was a disease of marmots and other steppe rodents that got stirred up perhaps by climate shifts and transferred to the black rat Rattus rattus and its faithful companion, the oriental rat flea Xenocilla chiapus. The movement from Central Asia to the Black Sea wasn't a quick jaunt. It was a slow creeping process along the caravans, but the maritime routes provided a terrifying speed boost. A quirky or fringe tidbit often cited is the infamous tale of the siege of Kaffa in 1346. It's alleged that the besieging Mongol army led by Johnny Beg began to die in droves from the plague. In a gruesome act of biological warfare, or maybe just desperation, the Mongols supposedly catapulted the infected corpses of their dead over the walls of the city and into the Genoese trading post. The horrified Genoese quickly fled by ship, unwittingly taking the flea-ridden black rats and the plague straight to Europe's doorstep. From Messina, the disease followed the established arteries of commerce and travel. It moved through the Mediterranean like fire on dry tinder. By early 1348, it had reached the bustling port of Marseille in France and the major trading hubs of Pisa and Venice in Italy. The great city centers of culture and wealth became death traps due to their density and reliance on incoming trade. You can imagine the fear in the port towns. Every sail on the horizon meant potential goods, but also potential disaster. The transmission inland was incredibly rapid. It wasn't always a slow creep from town to town. Instead, the infection often leaped across distances carried by infected people, or critically, by the clothes and belongings they carried. By mid-1348, the plague had struck Paris, Bordeaux, and the cities of Spain. By 1349, it had reached England, entering through the southern ports like Melcombe Regis, modern-day Weymouth, and swept northwards into Scandinavia. This speed of spread is the core of the scholarly debate we keep running into. Historians still argue whether a strict flea-to-rat-to-human cycle can fully account for the Black Death's devastating rate of dispersal, especially in the cold winters of Northern Europe when fleas are less active. Perhaps the pneumonic form spread by breathing played a much larger role in the initial European wave than initially acknowledged. Or maybe it was simply the combination of the bubonic form along the trade routes and the sudden explosive spread of the pneumonic form inside the cramped, unhygienic houses and monasteries. It's like a deadly relay race with rats' fleas and human coughs all passing the bacterium forward. And the population was uniquely vulnerable. Not because they were especially weak, but because medieval towns were perfect incubators. Packed housing, minimal sanitation, open sewers, and a pervasive rat population meant a flea had only a short, happy jump from a dead rat to a living person. And once inside, your body, remember, it was a 3 to 5 day countdown to either an agonizing death or, in those rare cases, a torturous recovery. The psychological impact of this invisible, unstoppable force was immediate. As you walk the street before the fever, you see the terror etched on every face. People are fleeing, but they don't realize that in fleeing, they are often carrying the disease with them, infecting the villages and rural areas they once considered safe havens. It's a tragic irony. A light joke, if you can find one in this darkness, might be the medieval belief that the sound of church bells ringing loudly could scare the pestilence away, a wonderfully futile gesture that probably just meant the town was now constantly bathed in the sad, desperate clangor of its own fear. This horrifying, relentless geographical expansion set the stage for the true human catastrophe. It wasn't just a handful of towns, it was a continent-wide demographic collapse. And next, look at the brutal numbers behind that collapse, the great mortality's scorecard. You've witnessed the arrival, the agonizing symptoms, and the rapid spread. Now the fear in the streets gives way to silence, and we must tally the immense human cost. This is the great mortality's scorecard, a stark review of the sheer scale of death across the continent, a catastrophic demographic event that defined the Middle Ages. The mainstream historical fact about the Black Death's toll is terrifyingly simple. Europe lost an estimated 30 to 60% of its total population in the initial outbreak between 1347 and 1351. To put that into perspective, imagine every other person, your neighbor, your friend, your colleagues, imply vanishing. Current estimates often settle around 25 million victims in Europe alone, though some historians push that number significantly higher, arguing for up to 50 million, when you factor in the Middle East and North Africa. This was not a localized disaster. It was a continental depopulation. In dense urban centers, the mortality rates were often far worse. Towns like Florence, Italy, or London, England, saw death rates soar to 50%, 60%, or even 70% in a single year. Think of the psychological breaking point of a society where the death count is higher than the number of healthy people available to bury the dead. We'll talk about that mass psychological shock later. But for now, focus on the mathematics of misery. The records that allow us to calculate this terrible scorecard are known as the bills of mortality, a practice that became more formalized in later plague outbreaks like London in the 17th century, but whose foundations lie in the grim, desperate record-keeping of the 14th century. Imagine the parish clerk himself, likely terrified, and ill scratching out names in a heavy ledger, the ink blurring from his sweat and tears trying to keep track of the sheer volume of souls lost. These crude statistics paint a picture of utter devastation. In some villages, entire families, and occasionally, the entire village itself were wiped out, leaving ghost settlements. A particularly chilling and quirky tidbit about this scale of death relates to the clergy. Monasteries and religious communities, due to their communal living close contact with the sick administering last rites, was part of the job, and often higher density populations were hit disproportionately hard. In some religious houses, the death rate approached 90%. Imagine a monastery that housed 100 brothers suddenly being reduced to 10, the knowledge and spiritual life of centuries collapsing in weeks. The sudden lack of priests meant people often died without the sacraments, adding a layer of spiritual panic to the physical suffering. The massive loss of life led to an immediate, profound disruption of the economic and social order. Fields lay fallow because there was no one left to plant them. Workshops were silent. Entire judicial systems ground to a halt. This demographic shockwave is a crucial, mainstream historical fact. The plague didn't just kill people. It killed the feudal system. With so few survivors, the value of labor skyrocketed, forever changing the relationship between the peasant and the lord. Suddenly, the surviving peasant had leverage. Of course, the debate rages on, and historians still argue whether the cause of the death was uniformly the same across the entire affected area. Was the plague that ravaged Florence in 1348 the same as the one that struck rural Norway in 1349? Genetic studies of excavated remains from mass graves strongly confirmed the presence of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the bubonic, pneumonic, and septicemic forms at various sites. However, the sheer speed and extent of the mortality have led some to propose that perhaps another highly contagious pathogen, perhaps a hemorrhagic fever, was also in play, or that the plague was simply more universally the pneumonic, highly airborne form than previously believed. Regardless of the precise microbial breakdown, the scorecard was final and horrific. Europe was profoundly and irrevocably changed. As the fever from your own personal infection, that painful bubo, begins to make you delirious, you see the death carts rolling past the window. The sheer volume of loss is what really crushes the spirit of the survivors. And as you fade, you're left with the memory of the panicked, desperate attempts to intervene, the misguided medicine that followed. The fever is so high now that you barely register the clamor outside, but the sounds that do penetrate your delirium are the arguments of the physicians and the fearful chanting of the priests. You've crossed the threshold from sick to dying, and as your body fails, we turn our attention to the tragically useless and often deadly attempts to save you. This is the era of misguided medicine, the ridiculous and often dangerous cures that medieval physicians prescribed to desperate patients. Remember that agonizing bubo from Section 2. The primary method of treatment, a mainstream historical fact, was not to fight the internal infection, but to purge it from the body. Since they believed the disease was caused by an imbalance of the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, the fix was to rebalance them. And the most common, terrible solution was bloodletting. Imagine a doctor completely covered in oil or wax making an incision near a major vein, often close to the bubo itself, to drain away the corrupted blood. This, of course, did nothing to fight the bacterial infection and only further weakened the already compromised patient, potentially leading to faster death from shock or secondary infection. It was a terrifying bloody ritual. If bloodletting didn't appeal, there was always the second popular method, making the bubo burst. We touched on this earlier, but the physicians' methods were far more gruesome than a simple folk poultice. They would apply plasters made of all sorts of bizarre and often repulsive ingredients to draw out the venom. One particularly grotesque remedy, a quirky or fringe tidbit, guaranteed to keep you awake, involved slathering the bubo with a paste made from dried toad or the excrement of a patient mixed with things like lily roots or dried flower petals. The idea was that the poison would be attracted to and absorbed by the foul application. If you wanted a slightly less disgusting option, some doctors suggested a poultice of powdered emeralds, assuming you could afford such extravagance on your deathbed. Other prescriptions for the sick included things that sound like bad cocktail ingredients, drinking a mixture of molten gold and powdered pearls for the wealthy naturally, or even a solution made with arsenic. The doctor's confidence, however misplaced, was absolute. The advice was often to remain calm, avoid excitement, and breathe only pure air, which they tried to create by burning fragrant woods like rosemary and pine within the home. The concept of miasma, that the plague was spread by foul odors or bad air, led to the stuffing of noses with potent herbs like mint thyme or even vinegar-soaked sponges. This mistaken belief is a crucial link to later plague prevention efforts. We'll talk about the iconic bird mask later, but its invention was based entirely on this wrong-headed theory. A light joke that unfortunately underscores the futility of it all. If you saw a doctor in the 14th century, the best thing they could prescribe was to avoid them altogether. Their success rate was, to put it gently, indistinguishable from zero. If you survived, it was because of your own immune system, not their attempts to bleed you dry or rub you with amphibian paste. The academic discussion, the concept that historians still argue whether the medical understanding of the time was a hindrance or a help, is particularly sad. Some scholars suggest the strict adherence to Galenic humoral theory meant that even experienced physicians were locked into treatments that actively harmed their patients. Others counter that the sheer volume of patients meant any treatment, no matter how ineffective, was a desperate psychological comfort, a necessary ritual in the face of oblivion. As the delirium washes over you, imagine the doctor, leaning over your bed, his face smeared with some acrid oil, holding a blood-stained knife, ready to perform a painful incision on that massive, throbbing bubo. This is the best help a billion bacteria could buy. But the focus on the symptoms, the swollen nodes and the black spots, distracted everyone from the true minuscule culprit, the rat, the flea, the fungus that we need to examine next. Your body is now a landscape of internal conflict ravaged by an enemy you can't even see. Having dismissed the doctor's toad paste remedies, we zoom in on the real culprits, the trio that orchestrated the greatest biological disaster in European history. This is a look at the rat, the flea, the fungusa, closer though gently sleepy examination of the Yersinia pestis bacterium and its non-human vectors. I call it the fungus, sometimes even though it's a bacterium, just to make you think about something gross and moist for a second. The true engine of the Black Death. The mainstream historical fact is the bacterium Yersinia pestis. Named much later for the French-Swiss bacteriologist Alexandre Yersin, who isolated it in Hong Kong in 1894, this tiny rod-shaped organism is the biological cause of the plague. It's a particularly vicious bug that has three main tricks up its microscopic sleeve. It can multiply inside a lymph node, bubonic enter the bloodstream and cause systemic damage, septicemic or infect the lungs, pneumonic. But Yersinia pestis needs transportation. And in the 14th century, its favorite taxi was the oriental rat flea, Xenocilla chaopis. Here's the grim mechanical process. The flea bites an infected, usually the black rat, Rattus rattus, which lived in close proximity to humans in homes and on ships. The flea ingests the infected blood, but the bacteria multiply so rapidly in the flea's gut that they form a sticky biological blockage. This blockage, known as a biofilm, means the poor flea starves. When it next attempts to feed, it can't swallow the new blood, so it regurgitates the infected bloody mass directly into the fresh bite wound of its next victim. It's a tragically effective delivery system, driven by the flea's desperate hunger. A truly quirky or fringe tidbit concerns the rats themselves. The black rat was a perfect vector because it was docile and loved to travel on ships and live in thatched roofs, keeping it close to human settlements. However, the rat population was also a victim. When the plague hit a city, the rats would die first in enormous numbers. It's only when the rat colony collapsed, removing the flea's natural host, that the starving fleas would jump onto the nearest warm body, the human. This created a spike in human infections. Shortly after the mass rat deaths, a macabre inverse relationship. The great scholarly debate, the phrase that historians still argue whether the black rat was solely responsible for the immense speed and scale of the 14th century outbreak, is fascinating. Many modern scholars now propose that while the rat-flea mechanism was the starter, human ectoparasites, specifically the human flea pulex irritans and human body lice may, have played a much larger role in transmitting the disease person to person once the epidemic was underway. Imagine the lice you carry on your clothes becoming miniature jumpy vectors in a densely packed, unwashed medieval city. This mechanism is far more resilient to cold weather and may better explain the terrifying spread in colder, less rat-friendly areas. It suggests that the disease transitioned to a more direct, human-centric cycle, making your neighbor not just the rodent in the wall the immediate threat. As you lie there, consumed by fever, you're experiencing the full systemic effects of this tiny bacterium. It's winning the war against your lymphatic system, the buboes, and it's poisoning your blood, the septicemic signs. You might hear the faint scratching of a rat in the wall, a sound that a year ago would have been an annoyance, but now sounds like the death rattle of the city. You remember hearing about how early on people were urged to kill all the dogs and cats, believing them to be the source of the plague. A light joke based on tragic misunderstanding, they killed the natural predators of the very rats that were carrying the fleas. Nice-going medieval public health officials. This microscopic, multi-stage attack from the flea's block to the bacterium's systemic poisoning is what made the Black Death so uniquely fatal. Now, as the suffering intensifies, see how society reacted to this invisible enemy by turning inward and seeking radical spiritual answers in the flagellant frenzy. Your physical torment, the high fever, and the agonizing buboes is now mirrored by the spiritual agony gripping the survivors. As medicine fails and logic collapses, society grasps for a divine explanation and a radical solution. This brings us to the flagellant frenzy, an examination of the rise of extreme religious penance movements during the crisis. The sheer scale of the Death Remember the Great Mortality's scorecard, from section foral to a mainstream historical fact, most people concluded the Black Death was not a medical event, but a divine punishment. It was God lashing out at a sinful humanity. If the plague was caused by sin, then the logical to them remedy was extreme penance, or showing God you were truly sorry. This theological panic fueled the rise of the flagellants. Imagine through your feverish window seeing processions filling the streets. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of men, draped in dark robes marked with red crosses, walking barefoot from the town to town. But the truly chilling part is what they carry heavy whips, tipped with iron spikes. The flagellants' purpose was self-mortification. They would gather in the public square and engage in a terrifying ritual that lasted for hours, often 3 times a day. They'd form a circle, sometimes stripped to the waist, and then in rhythmic unison, they would strike themselves repeatedly across the back and shoulders, until the air was filled with the sickening sound of flesh tearing and the smell of fresh blood. A light joke, though dark, you know you're having a bad day when your idea of a good time is hitting yourself repeatedly with a metal-tipped whip in public. They believed that by publicly inflicting on themselves the pain that should have been humanity's punishment, they could appease God and halt the plague. This was a direct, literal attempt to atone for the collective sins of man. A quirky or fringe tidbit about the flagellants is how rapidly they transformed from a pious group into a dangerous, rebellious cult. They became incredibly powerful, marching through towns, preaching, and sometimes even dictating municipal policy. Their movement was marked by anti-clericalism. They openly defied the authority of the church, claiming that their suffering and direct communication with God made them holier than the local priests and bishops. The sheer volume of death had so destabilized society that for a time they operated outside of any established authority. They demanded confession, absolution, and performed their own pseudo-sacraments. Their extremism also led to horrific persecution. The flagellants often targeted the Jewish communities who were already isolated and served as convenient scapegoats for the unexplainable disaster. They accused Jewish people of poisoning the Wellsan, absurd claim that tragically resonated with a panicked, superstitious populace. The resulting waves of pogroms and massacres that followed the flagellants' path are a grim part of the plague's legacy. Ultimately, the flagellant movement became so disruptive that the Pope Clement VI condemned them in 1349, issuing a papal bull against them. Monarchs and local authorities, fearing the political chaos and bloodshed they caused, stepped in to suppress them violently. The movement faded as quickly as it arose, showing that while spiritual terror could briefly overcome temporal law, it couldn't sustain itself against organized force. The scholarly debate here is rich. Historians still argue whether the flagellant movement was a genuine spiritual response to existential terror, or if it was primarily a socio-political revolt dressed in religious fervor, a way for the disenfranchised to temporarily seize power and wealth in a chaotic world. It was probably a complicated mix of both a desperate, bloody lashing out against an invisible enemy. As the cries and whips fade and you sink back into your straw, you've seen the collective psychological breakdown of the age. But the political leaders, however inept, eventually tried to respond with tangible, though harsh, measures. This leads us out of the spiritual hysteria and into the practical, unforgiving world of the quarantine's cruelty. The self-inflicted pain of the flagellants has passed, and your delirious mind now processes the sounds of official enforcementa, chilling, distant cry of all out, or maybe the hammering of wood. This transition moves us from spiritual panic to cold, bureaucratic survival. We examine the quarantine's cruelty, detailing how governments attempted to isolate the sick and exploring the surprising origins of the term itself. The initial chaotic response to the plague's spread was simply to flee, as we saw in Section 3, which was disastrous. However, as the disease raged Italian, city-states being heavily invested in maritime trade and accustomed to sophisticated governance, began to develop formalized public health measures. This is a crucial mainstream historical fact. Isolation and travel restrictions were the only truly effective, non-magical defenses they stumbled upon. Imagine you're a sailor arriving in the Venetian lagoon. You're feeling perfectly fine, but the officials on shore aren't taking any chances. They don't have antibiotics, but they do have rules. They force your ship to anchor offshore, banning anyone from disembarking for a set period. This practice was the foundation of what we now call quarantine. The quirky or fringe tidbit here is the origin of the word. Early in the plague, the isolation period decreed by authorities in Venice was originally 30 days, called Trentino. However, they quickly realized 30 days wasn't quite long enough to ensure the sickness was fully out of the system. So they extended it to 40 days, or 40 giorni in Italian. Thus, the word quarantine was born from the Italian word for fortia, grim mathematical legacy of the plague. The cruelty of quarantine lay in its unforgiving nature. If a member of your family like you began to show the terrible signs of fever, and the bubo, the entire household, might be forcibly sealed inside your home, sometimes literally boarded up from the outside. Guards were often posted outside to ensure compliance, with severe penalties for anyone attempting to escape. You lying there in your fever would hear the awful sound of the planks being nailed across your door and windows. This isolation was a death sentence for the family, not just the infected individual, as the close quarters often ensured the disease spread quickly via the pneumonic form. City gates were also shut tight to prevent the entry of the infected from surrounding villages. The rich and powerful, naturally, had a way out. They retreated to their isolated country estates, taking their families and essential servants with them. The famous writer Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, a collection of stories told by 10 young people who had fled the plague in Florence, perfectly illustrates this escape of the wealthy Elatia Testament to the fact that money could at least temporarily buy you distance from the great mortality. Historians still argue whether the practice of quarantine was ultimately more beneficial for public health or more catastrophic for the individuals involved. While it may have slowed the overall spread of the plague between cities by interrupting the transport of the rat-2 flea vector, the forced confinement of the sick with the healthy almost certainly accelerated mortality rates within the confined households. It was a brutal choice sacrifice, the individual to save the city. The legacy of these early public health measures is long. Along with the quarantine came the establishment of pest houses or lazarettos, segregated facilities built outside city walls to hold the infected. This was the first organized attempt at institutionalizing the care, or at least the containment of the highly contagious. You're now left alone in the dark, the sounds of official separation echoing in your ears. The initial wave of the Black Death eventually subsided, but the bacteria Yersinia pestis never truly left Europe. It settled into the local rat populations, waiting for the right conditions to strike again. And it did, resulting in major devastating sequels. The most famous of these subsequent outbreaks struck a familiar capital and is next on our journey, London's Great Plague of 1665. You've survived the initial horror of the 14th century, but the bacteria, that tenacious Yersinia pestis, has settled in for the long haul. Fast forward 300 years, the year is 1665, and the disease is staging a spectacular, terrible comeback in England's capital. We're now immersed in London's Great Plague of 1665, exploring this later major outbreak, its unique features, and the grim accuracy of the bills of mortality. Though separated by centuries, the disease that is now killing you in a cramped, wooden London tenement feels exactly the same. The fever, the agonizing buboes in your armpit or groin, the dark mottling of the skin, the core symptoms of the bubonic plague, are a chillingly persistent mainstream historical fact. The difference this time is the degree of organization, both in public response and in the documentation of the misery. The Great Plague began quietly in the spring of 1665, but by the summer it was exploding. The wealthy elite, including King Charles II and his court, wisely fled London, retreating to Hampton Court and Oxford. Just like the Florentine nobles centuries earlier, distance was the best defense. This is a cruel continuity of history. The poor are always left to face the worst of the pandemic. One unique feature of this later plague was the existence of the bills of mortality. These were weekly reports published by the parish clerks detailing the causes of death for that week. While their accuracy was questionable, many deaths were still attributed to vague ailments like griping in the guts or fever. They provide a terrifying quantitative look at the epidemic's peak. You would anxiously check the bill each week, the plague column swelling from dozens to hundreds, and eventually in September 1665 to over 7,000 deaths in a single week. This ritualistic public tally of the dead added a layer of sustained dread. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this era is the grim role of the searchers of the dead. These were often elderly women, usually poor, hired by the parishes to inspect the bodies and report the cause of death. Imagine having one of these women enter your sick room, their only job to confirm if those telltale swellings meant you had the plague. They were supposed to use the bills of mortality to assign a cause, and they were paid per body, meaning they had every incentive to be swift and sometimes careless. They were constantly exposed to the disease, making them a tragic and short-lived professional class. This period also gives us the image of the now famous plague doctor, though we'll fully debunk the beak mask later. But the doctors of 1665 did have slightly better protective clothing than their 14th century counterparts, often consisting of waxed leather robes. As you lie here, weak and barely able to breathe, you might hear the grim, insistent cry of the dead cart collectors. The carts were designed to make collection easier and less personal. Their cry of "bring out your dead" became the haunting anthem of the epidemic. A light joke in this dark time. Many people believed the plague was spread by cats and dogs, so London's Lord Mayor ordered the immediate slaughter of thousands of pets. This, of course, killed the natural predators of the rats, likely helping the flea-carrying rodents thrive. Once again, well-meaning actions only exacerbated the problem. Historians still argue whether the severity of the 1665 Great Plague was due to a more virulent strain of Yersinia pestis, or simply the perfect storm of London's overcrowding, poor sanitation. It lacked a comprehensive sewer system and a cold, wet environment that kept the rat-flea cycle humming. Whatever the exact cause, the total estimated loss of life in London was around 100,000 people. The suffering of 1665, your suffering wasn't just physical. It was about the complete breakdown of the social fabric. This leads us seamlessly into the next section, the terrifying reality of living with death, when the number of corpses overwhelms all capacity for dignified burial. The plague has now stripped away the dignity of death. The fever is ebbing, replaced by a terrible, sinking exhaustion. And you hear only the sounds of despair. We are looking at the consequences of the great mortality, when the sheer volume of death fractured society. Living with death, the psychological and societal breakdown that occurred when bodies piled up faster than burials could be managed. Imagine the atmosphere of terror and abandonment. When you first fell ill, your family might have tried to care for you, applying those ridiculous, useless poultices. But as the plague accelerated, the desire for self-preservation often overcame familial bonds. A horrifying mainstream historical fact is the widespread abandonment of the sick. Spouses fled, spouses' parents abandoned their children, and children left their ailing parents. The fear was a rational response to an unseen, hyper-contagious killer, yet the cruelty of the era was immense. To get better, or simply to survive, you had to be willing to condemn your loved ones. The most visible sign of societal collapse was the inability to bury the dead properly. The sheer volume of corpses, which included entire families, overwhelmed the small parish cemeteries. The churchyards filled rapidly, forcing the creation of enormous mass graves or plague pits, often dug outside the city walls. In the final stages of the epidemic, the dead were simply stacked onto the carts, uncoffined, and dumped into these vast trenches with a layer of quicklime thrown over them to hasten decomposition before the next layer of bodies was added. The lack of proper rites and the knowledge that your body would simply be piled with strangers stripped the survivors of their final comfort, a dignified Christian burial. The psychological toll was immense. People lived in a constant state of anticipatory grief. A quirky or fringe tidbit from the period is the rise of the carpe diem attitude, an immediate panicked hedonism. If death was coming for everyone anyway, why not spend your last days in drinking, feasting, and pleasure? The writer Boccaccio described groups of people who decided to live in isolation, with friends spending their time dining, singing, and telling stories, resolving to take only the minimum necessary precautions and die laughing as opposed to dying weeping. This desperate partying was as much a reaction to the plague as the flagellant's self-flogging. The breakdown of essential services was immediate. With so many clerks, laborers, bakers, and priests dead, the institutions that held the medieval world together, the courts, the markets, the monasteries, ceased to function. This led to a brief, chaotic vacuum, where social rules broke down. There are records of opportunistic looting, and people simply taking over the property of those who had died. The normal rhythm of medieval life church services, market days, seasonal farming was replaced by the sound of the death cart, and the smell of burning pitch meant to purify the air. Historians still argue whether the most damaging long-term effect of the plague was the demographic collapse or the profound shift in the mentality of the survivors. Did the experience of such widespread, random, and terrifying death lead to a more secular, cynical, and individualistic society? Or did it conversely reinforce the need for greater piety, as seen in the later proliferation of charitable institutions and religious art? It is likely that the terror led to both extremes. Your suffering, the pain in your bubo, the delirium, is now just background noise to the larger catastrophe. You are simply another casualty in a city that can no longer mourn its dead. The only people who dared to come near you were either driven by religious duty or, worse, were the self-appointed medical staff. These latter figures, with their strange protective gear, loom large in our collective memory of the plague, and we need to face the truth behind the image of the plague doctor's mask. You're nearing the end of your feverish journey, and one image dominates the terror of the sick room, the looming figure standing over you, clad in leather with an unnerving, long-beaked mask. We need to address this iconic figure head-on in a tone meant to gently correct the historical record as you drift off. This section is dedicated to the plague doctor's mask, specifically debunking the myth of the bird mask and exploring the actual simpler attire of the physicians who dared to approach you. Here's the soothing, if slightly disappointing, mainstream historical fact. The famous ghoulish plague doctor costume with the long bird-like beak was not worn during the original Black Death of the 14th century. That image, which is so pervasive in modern media, wasn't invented until the 17th century, nearly 300 years later. The outfit was designed around 1619 by Charles de Lorme, the chief physician to several French kings. It was essentially an early form of a hazmat suit, used during the later waves of plague, particularly the Italian outbreaks of the 17th century, and London's Great Plague of 1665, which we just explored. The core components of the 17th century outfit were designed for full coverage. A heavy ankle-length outer gown, often made of goatskin or waxed canvas, to repel fluids, breeches tucked into boots, a wide-brimmed hat to denote a doctor, and a cane to poke or examine the patient without direct contact. Now the mask itself, the star of the show, had that unmistakable, curved 6-inch-long beak. The reason for the beak ties directly back to the misguided medicine of the miasma theory, bad air. The long nose was stuffed with aromatic items, dried flowers, herbs like mint and lavender camphor, or a vinegar sponge. The quirky or fringe tidbit is that the doctor didn't wear this to ward off germs, which they didn't know existed. They wore it to filter the pestilential air, and perhaps more practically to simply block the indescribable stench of decaying bodies and suppurating bubos from reaching their nose. It was effectively a very creepy air freshener. The irony, of course, is that the heavy leather and waxed robe might have actually provided some small accidental protection by preventing flea bites and acting as a barrier against bodily fluids. Just wasn't for the reasons the doctor thought. The beak, which they thought purified the air, did little for the pneumonic plague's airborne droplets. The actual attire of the 14th century physician, the doctor who was standing over you in the grip of the first great plague, was far simpler and less dramatic. It was likely just their ordinary robes, perhaps treated with oils or perfumes, and maybe a simple piece of cloth over the mouth. This lack of protection is why, as we noted, the death rate among the clergy and the early physicians who tended the sick was appallingly high. They had no effective barrier against the contagion. Historians still argue whether the 17th century plague doctor costume was a serious medical tool or a cynical psychological one. Did it actually deter the disease, or did it simply create an imposing, terrifying figure that communicated authority and ritualistic seriousness even as the treatments failed? It is certainly true that the image became a powerful cultural symbol of death and fear, often appearing in street theater long after the great outbreaks ended. You feel a final flicker of awareness. The plague doctor, whether in his simple 14th century garb or the later, more theatrical 17th century suit, represents the terror of the unknown and the desperation of the age. But the plague was not just a killer. It was a profound agent of change. By wiping out so many, it set the stage for a world where your labor suddenly had value. We turn now to the surprising aftermath, economic collapse and rebirth. You survived. Against all odds, the fever has broken, the swelling in your bubo is slowly subsiding, and you have entered the long, painful phase of recovery. You are one of the fortunate few who are now part of the radically altered world that the plague left behind. We turn from the biological terror to the macroeconomic shock, economic collapse, and rebirth, examining how the massive labor shortage surprisingly improved life for the plague survivors. The initial effect of the Great Mortality was catastrophic. The economy of Europe came to a screeching halt, mainstream historical fact. With half the population gone, fields were left untilled, bakeries closed, and crafts ceased production. This seemed like a pure collapse, yet it immediately and dramatically shifted the balance of power. The great equalizer in the aftermath of the plague was the value of human life and labor. Before the plague, you, the peasant or common laborer, were abundant and easily replaceable. The feudal system was predicated on this surplus of labor. Afterward, your labor was gold. There were suddenly too few hands to work the land. This scarcity led to an immediate, massive increase in wages. If one lord wouldn't pay a good wage, the manor next door, desperate for workers, certainly would. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that in England, Parliament tried to fight this economic reality by enacting the Statute of Labours in 1351. This law attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and forbade laborers from moving to seek better employment. The law was an absolute failure. The economic reality supply and demand was simply too powerful for the government to suppress. The workers now had leverage, and they used it, ignoring the law and demanding higher pay and better conditions. For the surviving serfs, this was a massive, unexpected social promotion. Serfdom, the system that tied a peasant to the land, rapidly eroded, because lords realized they had to offer freedom and money, not coercion, to attract workers. Survivors found themselves inheriting property, moving into better-built homes, and critically having access to better diets because there were fewer people competing for food resources. This improvement in the standard of living for the common person is a profound, if tragic, legacy of the plague. The long-term effects were felt across all sectors. Craft guilds, for instance, could no longer maintain their restrictive entry requirements. The demand for trained artisans was so high that standards dropped and training was rushed. This burst of labor mobility and social fluidity was a vital part of Europe's move away from the medieval feudal model toward a more modern capitalist one. A light joke in this context, the plague was paradoxically the best thing that ever happened to the average working person's career prospects. Historians still argue whether the economic upheaval caused by the Black Death was the primary driver of the end of the Middle Ages, or if it merely accelerated social and economic trends that were already underway, like the monetization of rents. Regardless, the plague acted as a powerful, indiscriminate force of creative destruction, demolishing the old order and laying the foundation for a new social structure. You rise stiff and weak, a survivor in a newly depopulated world. The smell of the miasma is gone, the ringing of the dead cart is silent, and you realize you have a new future, a slightly richer and freer future because of the deaths of millions. This terrible windfall, however, was reflected in the culture that the survivors created. An art steeped in the morbid reality of random death. We'll now observe the emotional processing of this trauma in the artistic aftermath. You are a survivor, physically healed, but psychologically scarred, bearing witness to a world that has irrevocably changed. The great wound the plague inflicted upon society wasn't just physical or economic. It was deeply spiritual and artistic. We now look at the way the survivors processed their trauma, the artistic aftermath examining the dance macabre, and other morbid cultural expressions of the era. With so many people having died a random, swift death, the prevailing artistic theme became the inevitability and impartiality of mortality, a mainstream historical fact known as the memento mori, remember you must die. Death was no longer a distant event, but an omnipresent familiar neighbor. This cultural shift manifested most vividly in the artistic motif of the texte cow dance macabre, the dance of death. Imagine this painted on a church wall, a vivid spectacle meant to teach a lesson, a skeletal animated figure of death leading a long, joyous-looking line of people to the grave. The victims are not just peasants, but popes, emperors, merchants, and children. The dance of death was a grim visual joke emphasizing that the plague had been the great leveler. It didn't matter your rank, your wealth, or your virtue. Death, the grinning skeleton, came for you all. This was the ultimate expression of the trauma rejection of the medieval social hierarchy in the face of universal doom. The art became darker, more visceral, and focused less on saintly miracles and more on the suffering of Christ and the terror of judgment. There was a fascination with decomposition and the fleeting nature of life. Tomb sculptures began to show not just the idealized effigy of the deceased, but also the gruesome, decaying, intextit, transy figure underneath, rotting, worm-eaten corpses to drive home the message of earthly vanity. A quirky or fringe tidbit is the sudden and widespread popularity of allegorical figures that represented the various forms of death or disease. While the Grim Reaper with his scythe is a later interpretation, the Black Death era popularized images of the death angel or pestilence demon, often depicted with arrows or darts flying over cities to strike victims randomly. The arrow, being a swift, unseen projectile, perfectly captured the sudden, inexplicable onset of the plague fever and the bubo. The rise of lay piety, personal non-clerical devotionis, another cultural marker. Since the traditional clergy had often fled or died, people turned to personal devotion, focusing on images of suffering like the Man of Sorrows or the Antextit Piet, Mary mourning Christ. This shift emphasized direct emotional communion with the divine rather than relying on the institutional church that had failed to stop the plague. The artistic expression was not just in painting and sculpture, it was also reflected in music and literature. Morbid, cautionary tales and planchons focused on themes of loss and the futility of human ambition. Historians still argue whether the increased morbidity in post-plague art represents a genuine spiritual decline or conversely a revitalized, more personal and intense form of faith that simply acknowledged the terrifying reality of life. Was it cynicism or realism? It's a subtle but important distinction, suggesting that the survivors had a renewed appreciation for life, even as they acknowledged its fragility. As you look out on this changed world, you understand that the trauma of the bubonic plague is the defining event of your era. But even with all the genetic evidence we have now, there remains a shadow of a doubt about the very nature of the enemy that caused all this suffering, a doubt that continues to fuel scholarly debate. It's time to fully unpack the mystery and ask historians still argue. You've witnessed the bubo, the fever, the flagellants, the economic shakeup, and the dance of death. Despite all we know and all the terror you survived, a profound mystery still surrounds the specific pathogen that killed up to half of Europe. This section is dedicated to the lingering academic uncertainty, asking historians still argue, unpacking the debate over whether the Black Death was only bubonic plague. The mainstream historical and scientific consensus, confirmed by a mainstream historical fact, the analysis of ancient DNA, aDNA, from plague pits in locations like the East Smithfield mass burial site in Londonus, that the culprit was indeed Yersinia pestis. This bacterium causes the bubonic, septicemic, and pneumonic forms of the plague. The genetic fingerprint is there, establishing that the Black Death was at its core a plague pandemic. However, the debate persists, fueled by three main points that historians and some scientists still argue over, which are difficult to reconcile with a purely flea-borne illness: the speed and scale of transmission. As you recall from Section 3, the speed at which the plague traveled across Europe, often hundreds of miles in a matter of months, even during cold northern winters, is faster than the known epidemiology of a disease relying primarily on a rat-flea-human cycle. Rats are slow to migrate, and fleas are less active in the cold. This has led some historians to suggest the pneumonic form, person-to-person airborne, must have been far more prevalent than previously believed, or that another more easily transmissible vector was at play, like the human, louse a quirky or fringe tidbit. The lack of rat evidence in chronicler accounts. Medieval accounts are rich with descriptions of the horrible human symptoms, but they rarely mention mass rat deaths preceding the human infections. Since rat die-offs usually signal a flea displacement event, the relative silence on massive piles of dead rats is puzzling to some scholars. This leads the opposition to suggest an entirely different disease may have been involved, possibly a highly virulent, infectious hemorrhagic fever, which would explain the rapid human-to-human spread and high mortality without relying on the rat reservoir. Inconsistent mortality. The plague seemed to jump erratically, hitting some regions very hard while skipping others entirely, even those geographically close. This randomness doesn't perfectly match the predictable spread along trade routes expected of a rat-borne disease. The consensus has been significantly strengthened by the aDNA findings. The presence of Y. pestis in the skeletons of victims essentially closes the door on the idea that the Black Death was not the plague. However, the modern debate has shifted to a more nuanced question. Was the 14th century Y. pestis strain simply far more virulent and efficient at causing the airborne pneumonic form than later strains? Or did the unique unsanitary and densely populated conditions of medieval European world, where everyone wore wool, slept packed together, and was covered in human lice, create a perfect transmission environment for Yersinia pestis that simply doesn't occur today? This is a powerful conclusion, even though you survived. And even with the tools of modern science, we still can't fully agree on the precise mechanics of your suffering. It's a reminder that history is rarely a closed case. The good news for a modern person like you is that we no longer live in the 14th century. But before you get too comfortable in your germ-free bubble, we must acknowledge that this ancient enemy hasn't been eradicated. It's time for our final observation: plague in the modern day. You survived the 14th century, you survived the 17th century relapse in London, and you're now a veteran of one of history's greatest killers. But as you finally settle into a slightly more peaceful post-plague reality, there is one final sober realization: the enemy is still out there. This brings us to plague in the modern day, a final look at the ongoing existence of Yersinia pestis, its treatment, and the potential for a modern resurgence. A crucial mainstream historical fact is that the plague never actually went extinct. The three great pandemics, The plague of Justinian's 6th century, the Black Death, and the second pandemic, 14th, 18th centuries, and the third pandemic, beginning in the late 19th century, were all caused by the same incredibly resilient bacterium. The Yersinia pestis bacterium retreated to its endemic reservoirs in wild rodent populations, particularly in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Today, the plague is classified as a rare but recurring infectious disease. The World Health Organization, WHO, reports a few thousand cases worldwide annually, primarily in parts of Africa, notably the Democratic Republic of Congo and Madagascar, and surprisingly, in the western United States, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and California, where it lives in ground squirrels, prairie dogs, and chipmunks. These cases are usually contained and treatable, which is the most reassuring difference between your 14th century nightmare and today. The key to treating the plague, if you were to contract it now, is a course of antibiotics such as streptomycin or gentamicin. This discovery, made centuries after the initial outbreaks, is why the Black Death, a disease that once killed up to 90% of those infected, now has a mortality rate of around 10% if treated promptly. If you, the plague survivor, could have had one simple modern medicine, it would have been this. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the plague bacterium remains a concern for global health security because it has historically been considered a potential agent of bioterrorism due to its high fatality rate in its pneumonic form, which is contagious, person to person, and the relatively easy means of cultivating the bacteria. Governments around the world maintain surveillance for unusual outbreaks. You're thinking of the bubo, the medieval pain, but today the greatest fear is an engineered or aerosolized version of the pneumonic plague. The ongoing scholarly debate centers on the potential for a major resurgence. Historians still argue whether global climate change or increased human encroachment on wild habitats could stir the ancient plague reservoirs, bringing infected rodents and their fleas into greater contact with human populations again. As we push into wilderness areas for logging or development, we disturb the natural balance, potentially creating new opportunities for the bacteria to jump hosts. While the terror of the Black Death feels like a distant historical memory, the fact remains that the agent of the great mortality is still very much alive. Your long, dark journey through the bubos and the bills of mortality ends with a final, quiet realization: histories. Most terrifying diseases are never truly conquered. They are only managed. It's time to let the long night finally claim you, not in sickness, but in rest. The final images of your journey now begin to soften and dissolve, blending into the quiet shadows of your room. Let the distant memory of the fever and the pain of the buboes slowly recede. You have walked with the dead, you have felt the fear of the medieval world, and you have, against the terrible odds, emerged. Breathe in now, slowly and deeply. You are not in a cramped, dark tenement in 14th century London. You are safe, resting in a world where the greatest terrors are now mostly confined to the past, and where a tiny pill can defeat the unseen enemy that once brought empires to their knees. Let the stillness of the air wash away the fear of the plague cart and the phantom pain of the bubo. The long dance with death is over, and you are here, warm and secure. The lessons of the plague, the resilience of the human spirit, the surprising ability of society to rebuild itself, and the eternal necessity of light and truth against darkness and fear, these are the gentle truths that remain. Let your mind become as quiet and smooth as still water. The sounds of the ancient world are fading, the whispers of history, becoming just a soft hum in the background. Drift now, let your thoughts become heavy and slow, sinking gently into the comfort of your bed. There is nothing left to fear tonight. Sweet dreams.